Hi, thank you for coming today. Sorry for the delay. Today we will have Nadia and her topics, interdisciplinary methods, how human variables shape human-inspired AI research. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting some work that I completed collaboratively with my colleague and friend, Fawn Rice, who is an independent researcher working out of Vancouver. We've recently presented this work at the International Conference on Computational Creativity. I'm grateful to be able to present to you today from Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory and in Métis Region 4. I've carried out my part of the project from here. My co-author engaged in her part of the project largely on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. However, this project has involved remote interviews with participants across North America and Europe, and so has also been shaped by our participants' relationships with different lands and peoples. Many of these lands have long, violent histories that have upheld some stories and erased others. As I have the opportunity to speak with you today, I want to encourage you to reflect on the histories of the lands we live and work on and how they shape our technologies and our communities. One community that I consider myself a part of is the artificial intelligence community. This is a community focused around a discipline, artificial intelligence. Now, one second, let's go back to my title slide. Today I'm talking about interdisciplinary methods in a... I'm not... Oh. Can you hear me now? Yes, I know that the people in the room can hear me. I got that. Oh, good, Rory can hear me. That's an excellent sign. I'm going to go back because I have an echo. Okay, apologies to those of you in the room. Please be patient. I just would like everyone to be to have access to what I said before. Well, okay. Well, I'm going to skip a little bit, but one of the things that I brought up was that I really want people today to be focusing on reflecting on the histories of the lands we live and work on and how they shape our technologies and our communities. Okay, so one community that I consider myself a member of is the artificial intelligence community. This is a community focused around a discipline, which is artificial intelligence. Now, let's go back to my title slide. And I said that I'm talking about interdisciplinary methods in AI research. Now, I don't think that the practice of artificial intelligence research has to necessarily be directly interdisciplinary. In AI, we can take techniques and methodology developed within artificial intelligence and mold those to suit new problems and make new developments. But there is a subset of AI researchers who are directly inspired by biological intelligence. They're fascinated by the way that humans and animals learn, and they believe in the power of this inspiration to help derive new insights for artificial intelligence. In particular, there are a number of researchers who have been inspired by some prominent concepts from human psychology. And they work on technologies that are analogs of these concepts. As examples, they might design computational analogs of creativity, forgetting, depression, emotion, imagination, or curiosity. And for those of you who know my other work, you might realize that I'm one of those researchers because I work on computational curiosity. So for this project, Fawn and I have been interviewing some of these researchers to learn more about what they do when designing systems inspired by psychological concepts. So far, we've interviewed 22 participants. To understand where the contents of this presentation fit into the larger project, it might be useful to know a little bit about our approach. So we're taking what's called a grounded theory approach. The framework around grounded theory encourages a practice of analyzing and reanalyzing data while a data collection is ongoing, and then allowing those earlier phases of analysis to shape later phases of data collection. In this presentation, I'm sharing some of the themes that have arisen in our first phase of data collection. So this is an ongoing project, and we are actively looking for more participants. So if you or someone you know is working on a computational analog of a psychological concept, we would really love to speak to you. And so we've been interviewing AI researchers who, by necessity, work with knowledge originating in disciplines other than artificial intelligence, because that's where a lot of scholarly knowledge on psychological concepts can be found. And the thing is, different disciplines have different modes of operation. In some ways, they operate rather like countries. For one thing, we speak our own languages. We elect our own officials. And many of us have disciplines that we would consider home. We found that when our participants set out for another discipline, it wasn't really easy. Several interviewees found that understanding what's going on in all of the different relevant fields was one of their biggest challenges as researchers. In response to these challenges, interviewees used heuristics that really affected which literature made it into their technologies and theories. Some interviewees recognized the role of serendipitous encounters with new ideas during daily life, and others traced some of what they had learned to popular culture. For example, one participant who researches computational creativity said that they were probably more likely to learn from a New York Times article profiling an artist than to actually read art history books. I mentioned before that different disciplines have their own languages. Prior work has suggested that the precise language, or jargon, required to achieve high levels of rigor in one discipline sometimes prevents access to readers who are external to that discipline. Our interviewees came up against those language barriers. In response, some relied on strategies like citation chaining, so that's tracing backwards or forwards from a useful source. Others teamed up with native speakers from other disciplines to help them sort through what to learn about. But we also came across interviewees who didn't really stray all that far from home. Instead, they were able to rely on work by seminal scholars who had done critical translation work for their field. For example, some of you might be aware of Margaret Bowden's work. For those of you who have attended RLDM, the Multidisciplinary Conference on Reinforcement Learning and Decision Making, she gave a keynote in 2017. And she's got a really well-known model of creativity. Several of our interviewees recognize her work as providing a huge service to cognitive and computer sciences. Similarly, we found examples of scholars in disciplines outside of computing who essentially paved the way for scholars external to their discipline by synthesizing a topic in popular nonfiction or in a textbook. At the time we were doing most of our data collection, the book Becoming Human by Michael Tomasello was making the rounds among academics at the borders of AI and psychology. It was a little bit like the book had gone viral within these subcommunities. This kind of knowledge translation in textbooks and in popular nonfiction is essential, but these genres can come with constraints. Editorial standards sometimes discourage authors from citing in text. Authors are typically offering a broad synthesis of ideas. We had interviewees who expressed concern about relying on works like these. While key pieces of knowledge translation can generate valuable new lines of thinking, it's also important to recognize that a single source can only provide a limited snapshot of a field. Scholarly conversations march on with time, and as time passes, a concept as it's known in artificial intelligence can become disconnected from those ongoing conversations in other disciplines. Like any cultural artifacts, our publications sit in cultural contexts. In this case, disciplinary cultural contexts. Our participants were generally quite aware of not having that full context. And in fact, some of our interviewees found the prospect of trying to adequately acknowledge an idea's disciplinary context so daunting that it almost seemed like a deterrent. For example, one grad student interviewee made the comment, "That's the difficulty with interdisciplinary work. You're never going to be just one or the other. You can't be the best at either field by devoting yourself to both, right?" But based on what we've learned so far, Fawn and I believe that we should encourage researchers to try not to be afraid to read broadly. Sure, your understanding won't be perfect and some disciplinary context is going to be lost. But even a small amount of time challenging yourself with new ideas from a different discipline can help to rekindle those connections across disciplinary conversations. And so we see this as an opportunity for reflection on how your choice of sources influences your work. We also came across a second common challenge among our interviewees. This challenge occurred at the point where researchers were drawing ideas from other disciplines into artificial intelligence. At this point, researchers discovered that the concepts in the human literatures, at least from an artificial intelligence researcher's point of view, are not really well defined. That phrase, human literatures, is one that we picked up from an interviewee. We basically started using it as shorthand for the literature coming from disciplines that specifically study humans, like psychology, social sciences, or neuroscience. And for our interviewees, the language in these human literatures felt open-ended. They described language that they were encountering using words like blurry, ambiguous, or more like a nice metaphor. At least in retrospect, I don't think that this challenge seems so surprising. After all, the activities of those of us developing artificial intelligence are starkly different from those of scholars in other disciplines, even if we are studying the same concepts. In artificial intelligence, we are often thinking algorithmically, And our lines of thinking tend to be oriented towards taking steps that would eventually give us the software or the hardware we would need to manifest a psychological concept like curiosity, creativity, or imagination. However, the challenge has its own consequences. Participants mentioned choosing some definitions over others because they were easier to formalize or to evaluate. One interviewee described looking through a survey of several competing definitions in psychology and landing on one that they considered easily translatable to reinforcement learning. So in some cases, researchers preferred to focus on ideas that already had direct computational parallels in artificial intelligence. One interviewee alluded to a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Is it even worth going down a route if there are no corresponding elements for a concept in the computational domain? And once interviewees had selected a definition, there was still a process of taking that definition designed for another discipline and translating it for artificial intelligence. One interviewee described the process as more like interpretation than translation. When interpreting with an artfully ambiguous definition from human literatures, interviewees made interpretive decisions along the way. And the fact that decisions are made is not a bad thing. These decisions are necessary for making progress. However, decisions such as these don't always make their way into final publications, despite potentially being very important. So I want to quote one of our interviewees about that potential importance. To do this translation of these psychological ideas, especially when they're ambiguous like most of them are, this process is what really makes the difference. It's not simple to do. And there are a lot of things in the process that are so important for the development of knowledge and insight. And so, we recommend attempting to articulate the choices made during the process of working with ideas from human literatures. The results might not only help future translators, but also track the changes in meaning that these concepts might be undergoing during this process. For this purpose, we can point out 2 stages where researchers might specifically record the decisions that they're making about using ideas from human literatures. First, there is the stage when the researcher is selecting or discarding potential definitions. Rather than citing only the final definition chosen, there's a chance here to forefront the original set of options and describe how that selection process rolled out. And then secondly, there's that interpretation stage. Whether you're building off of correspondences from psychological elements that are taken to the computational domain that already exist, or you're coming up with a new computational formulation, even just keeping a kind of diary or field log can help preserve those choices so that they can be shared later. Field logs or other descriptions of your own research processes can be used later as data. So to provide an example, we would really love to share what we think is a nice demonstration of an author employing reflection about their team's decision-making procedures within a paper. This is actually a psychology paper by Alan Fisk. And in this paper, Fisk is arguing against using our natural language labels, or in the paper they use this technical term, vernacular lexemes, to identify psychological constructs. Fisk begins the paper with a brief narrative of the events that led him to the main argument. First, he recounts a conversation that sparked an entire line of research. In this case, a colleague of Fisk's mentioned that he was perplexed at finding himself shedding tears during scenes of loving kindness in children's movies, despite feeling happy. And the 3 researchers involved in that first conversation were intrigued. They hypothesized that perhaps he was shedding tears because he was feeling moved. And so they began exploring this idea of being moved. Fisk summarizes their initial exploratory research activities in the paper. He recalls finding that English-speaking participants often describe moving experiences using near but not quite exact synonyms like touching or heartwarming. Eventually, his team started considering near synonyms from languages other than English, which was made easier by the fact that many of the members of the team spoke multiple languages. The team eventually came to the realization that a given vernacular lexeme from one of the world's 7,000 different languages rarely maps one-to-one onto an exactly corresponding vernacular lexeme in another language. I really recommend checking out the paper for more details, but in the end, Fisk credits the multilingualism of his research team with protecting them from conflating a vernacular lexeme, being moved, with the features of a mental state. So not only is Fisk's story engaging, it's got characters and conflict that has to be resolved, but the reader is also provided with explanations of how different approaches like the literature review and participant observation, but also happenstance, like the composition of the team, fit into the development of the final argument. These details can be hugely useful for future researchers. And while I'm here, I also have to point out, this paper also lends itself as food for thought for those of us in artificial intelligence. After all, the examples of psychological concepts that I've been using throughout this talk, like curiosity, creativity, and forgetting, these are also all examples of using vernacular lexemes to describe psychological constructs. And this is exactly what Fisk is warning about. But I'll save my perspectives on that for another talk. So we've made this recommendation for you, and it might be kind of easy to say. However, researchers will not be able to take this advice if these kinds of papers are not accepted. If we want to see the potential benefits, including the benefit of supporting others who want to undertake similar research, we have a responsibility as a community to uplift those papers that include reflection on selection and interpretation processes. And so I hope that you'll keep this in mind next time that you're reviewing papers. The first publication on our project explores the challenges of interdisciplinary research. We've made a few recommendations based on our first phase of analysis. However, we do recognize that this being early stage findings, there are a number of limitations. As this project proceeds, we will be refining our ideas through additional data collection, working towards the point at which gathering more data no longer results in new theoretical insights. And in grounded theory, that's known as theoretical saturation. For example, the interviews that I've discussed in this presentation primarily took place before November 2022. So there might be some little things like ChatGPT that could potentially spark new ideas. Importantly, we want to expand the diversity of experience represented by our cohort of interviewees. We alluded to this in our title, but we already see quite clearly that human variables shape the research being done. Our interviewees are researchers, but they're also humans. They have rich, multifaceted lives and histories that influence their work. Many of our interviewees were also artists. We had the chance to learn more about how interviewees' personal histories influence what they see as valuable and what brings them satisfaction or joy, and therefore what they feel is worth studying. This influence makes it doubly important for us to seek interviewees with diverse histories. And so, while we've tried to showcase some of the ways that human variables influence research progress, we certainly don't claim that these variables can or should be eliminated. Rather, we want to suggest that recording and sharing them will support clearer reflection on how artificial intelligence is shaped. I think that the sentiment was really well expressed by one of our interviewees, who said, "I've learned early on that the best research comes from our lived experience and intuition about the world. Once you have some hypotheses, then you apply the scientific method and do things properly. But it's motivated by our own experiences, and that's where I see the best work getting done. I don't think we can research something that we don't live." To conclude my talk, I do want to leave you with a summary of my recommendations. First, try not to be afraid to read broadly, even though you know that disciplinary context is going to be lost. Second, attempt to record and share the choices that you've made in your selection and interpretation processes. And lastly, join together as a community to support the legitimacy of reflexive data. And as a bonus recommendation, please contact Fawn and I. We would actually really love to discuss this work further with you. And then kind of like last of all, I do have my PhD defense the Tuesday after next, so you're all invited to my public seminar. And it will be about what curiosity could and should mean in artificial intelligence. So if you are curious about curiosity, it would be great to have you there. Thank you.
We have a mic here for questions if anyone has one. I have maybe one. So in interdisciplinary research, usually like you begin with a researcher maybe treating both fields that you're being interdisciplinary with respect to as equals, but sometimes I think as AI researchers, sometimes we start with the AI research, do some experiments, and then after the fact try to interpret some computational phenomenon or some type of behavior and mapping that back to some almost human term that we have, right? I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, what these types of like computational vernacular lexemes might mean for bridging the gap between human research and computational research.
Cool question, thank you. I guess I need to repeat the question. I don't think that people can hear it. And part of the question, at least, was reflecting on sort of what computational vernacular lexemes, well, I guess they're no longer vernacular. They're almost like, this is the jargon, right? What those mean as when we're taking, we do our work ahead of time, and then we eventually were like, oh, it could map to this thing in human psychology. And I think that this is maybe not a perfect answer to your question, But this is a good opportunity to, I guess, think about which sources you're going to when you're deciding which, like what you're trying to map it to. And which sources are you not going to when you're, I mean, you might not know, but you should at least consider that there are probably a wide variety of choices about where you can go and pick your map, essentially. And those are things that you can include. Like you can write about these, provide those field logs I mentioned to provide, I guess, yeah, some data later on that says, well, I picked this particular mapping, but someone else might go through and find a different one. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
There's a question from Shiva, and he's asking, what is the benefits of using these human literature terms when describing the computational AI works? For instance, why do you still keep the word curiosity in your own work? Maybe it's for making the algorithm more relatable and keeping curiosity as opposed to saying something like optimal exploration or sufficient coverage.
That is a really excellent question, and it's something that I've actually written about in my thesis. So I'll probably even talk about it the Tuesday after next if anyone wants to come. But as a little spoiler here, one of the reasons that I think it's useful for us to continue talking about these vernacular lexemes is that they bring people together. I think that people are like, I don't know, curiosity shapes our lives. We notice and we talk about it with other people. When you change, so like Alan Fisk ends up using kamamuta to describe the actual mental construct that they want. And that's really important. But I think it's also really important to mention that it's relating back to these vernacular lexemes that we actually care about. Nobody gets into, I don't know, doing this kind of research because they wanted to, like, I don't know, they wanted to research something that they've never heard of. Often they come here through these pathways of, like, I'm excited about curiosity. I'm excited about how it affects me. And so that's part of the reason that I research it. Does that answer your question, Shivam?
So you said you interviewed 22 people, and perhaps you didn't change the questions as during the study, but if you did, I'm curious how they changed, and maybe like after you've already heard like the outcomes of these 22 interviews, are there different questions that you would ask, I guess, if you could do a do-over?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I wish I had done a review of the questionnaires as they have changed. So yes, we use semi-structured interviews, so that means that we're following the conversation where it goes. We don't always use all of our sort of set out questionnaire items. We often will sort of shift and follow up on things that sound very interesting. And, but the actual questionnaire itself has also changed with time, and I'd be happy to go and find those differences, and we could talk about them more later. But I don't know them off the top of my head.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was very, very interesting. I especially like the recommendation to read broadly, right? Because, I mean, some bias there because I like to do that, and I think that choices I've made are good ones. But anyway, the point being that, yeah, so I really like to think about intelligence in terms of what other related fields have thought about, right? Like cognitive psychology, neuroscience, ethology, whatnot. And I also try to get other people into trying to do that, but I often face some resistance in terms of, since we are all like, you know, young researchers trying to get into this field, trying to understand what reinforcement learning is about, what AI is about, there is this sort of hesitance to be, you know, a jack of all trades but master of none, like something that you also alluded to. So what are your recommendations in that sense, like more, perhaps something more pragmatic about how this is useful? Because like this is the sort of resistance I face from in the conversations that I have with other people who I want to encourage into doing this sort of reading.
Absolutely. Okay, so for the people online who may not have heard the question, it was about the, I guess, concern of being a jack of all trades and a master of none. So if you focus on spending your, if you, I guess, spend your time doing that reading broadly, you may not be as strong and specialized a researcher in that one area that maybe you feel like you need to be. And I do agree that there's a trade-off there. Time is small. But I think that there's a huge benefit in like seeing where the ideas kind of take you. I think that you learn, like by learning about these things, they shape, one of our interviewees talked a lot about how they don't always know exactly where these ideas came from, but they have this sort of breadth of knowledge that they are able to sort of shape their beliefs about how intelligence might work, and that helps them to create new ideas. And so I think that we probably need people who do both. I mentioned earlier on, I think that there are people who can take AI and continue to just do AI within AI. But I think that it's also great to have people doing the other thing. It's great to have those of us who want to read broadly, and I think that having both groups means that we'll end up with a balanced field as long as we continue to talk to one another.
Cool, thank you so much.
So this is maybe about your second recommendation, record and share the choices you've made. So I find that a lot of times when I make choices, I don't even realize I'm making those choices because we have so much acculturation, and like sometimes you read something and you know what it means and you don't even realize that there could be other interpretations of what you read, right? So do you have any recommendations for how to be more introspective about like understanding the fact that you are making choices while you make them, rather than just saying that, well, that's the obvious way to think about it because that's what you know. Right?
I feel like this relates back to having time as well, and I think that a lot of us feel the push to rush forward, and I've come up with an interpretation I need to, I guess, make my algorithm and go. And I think that that's a weakness. I think that we do, there's an interesting paper out there that's like researching fast and slow, where we need to have a balance of slowing down and thinking about the breadth of things that we could have done. I don't think that that's easy, so I don't think I have like a go-to strategy that will solve that for you. But if you can sort of like get yourself to slow down, I would also talk to other people, especially people who are not working on the exact same thing as you. And if you want to create some great data for social scientists and those of us doing these kinds of collaborations, you could record those conversations, and that would be awesome. Oh, I totally did not repeat the question. The question for those of you online was about sometimes not knowing that you've made an interpretive decision until you've kind of gone forward. And this idea of like looking for strategies to become more introspective. And I completely agree that it's a challenging thing to do, but I hope that you'll push yourself.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much, Nadia. It was a great talk, so thank you very much for that. The second thing is, this is not really a question, but it's a cautionary statement for the audience themselves. I think people are so involved in the particular details that they forget that, for example, reinforcement learning itself came from psychology. It's basically an algorithmic way of describing behaviors that psychologists had seen when animals, like people or other sorts of animals, learn something. So I think thinking about our problems in that perspective, at least for the reinforcement learning guys in the audience, which is probably most of them, is a good idea. But a lot of times we forget. I met a guy once who goes, "Isn't it all just about, numbers and equations?" I'm like, "Oh, Jesus, are you serious?" Yes, it could be, but there's much more to it, and I think you're going to be more informed. So I encourage people to read broadly and learn really where some of these things came from. They didn't just come from last year's, AC3 something or other algorithm, right? Right? There's a lot more meat to it than that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. For those of you online, to summarize as well as I can, it was a bit of a cautionary tale that don't forget that this is not all just mathematics and algorithms. This, for many of us, this is a largely reinforcement learning based group. Those ideas, the foundations of the work that we've been working on, that came from biological, trying to sort of algorithmically describe biological things that people were observing. And I think that inspiration holds true still.
I think we have time for one last question. If not, I have a two-parter. One is a concrete question, one is more open-ended. I was wondering, what were the demographics of the interviewees? What kind of departments did they hail from? That's the concrete part. And the more open-ended part is, did you notice any trends that didn't make it into the recommendations that you thought might be interesting?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I think. Okay, I'm going to read out Fawn's thing after I've talked about this. The demographics of our cohort were not as diverse as we would like. So we are doing snowball sampling, so that means that after we do an interview, we're like, hey, we're looking for more people to talk to, can you help us out? And even when we were sort of pressing people to think about underrepresented demographics, it's still quite challenging. So we used those of our interviewees who used she, her pronouns as a proxy, and we ended up with probably about 25% in the she, her range and more in the he, him range. And we looked this up, and it looks like it's pretty reflective of artificial intelligence, but that doesn't, like, I think we would still like to do a little bit better if we can, so I'm hoping you all can help me out here. And other demographics, we have, it's in the paper, there's a few things where we talk about the number of grad students, the number of postdocs, the number of full professors we have, and there's a mix. I think there's sort of more in the like medium range. We talked to a bunch of sort of assistant professor level folks. I should really open up the paper though, so I might be lying to you. Other demographics that might be interesting, we didn't hit anything really other than North America and Europe so far, and so that has a big impact, and so we would like to be able to find people more broadly. Other demographics that I'm like not, coming up on the spot. Anything else you were curious about?
I guess I should read the paper.
Yes, and I can get you more details on it than we even have in the paper if you'd like, so I can help you out with that for sure. Can I read out Fawn's thing? She wanted to comment. I'm sorry, I'm going to read it out anyways. Regarding the reflexivity question, Fawn said that she thinks it's a really great question and hard practice. She finds that a lot of folks in health research, where grounded theory actually came from originally, they do a great job of formalizing reflective practice in research and have some of the clearest guides for it. And so there's an article that she's found helpful with a list of strategies. If you want that, I can pass it on to you. So just come up to me after the talk, and I'll make sure that you get the link if you're not in the Zoom.
Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you. Here. Thank you.